I grew up in Berkeley, and my mother's are lesbians, and Berkeley's kind of wild, and lesbians are kind of wild. At least my lesbians.
Radical feminist
lesbians. I mean, you read all these articles about people in the 60s who went and lived on women's land, and we did not live on women's land, but we might have well half. I mean, everyone I knew growing up was lesbian, and I think it was amazing, and I loved it. One of my mothers is also European; she's from Sweden, and so I think what it allowed me to do is it allowed me to have one foot in sort of mainstream society and one foot out of it, which could be a really uncomfortable place. And I feel like a lot of people who've grown up that way feel like they're not at home in either. But I have really excellent parents and a really excellent support system. And so I think what it gave me is it gave me fluency in multiple ways of being in multiple languages. And it also allowed me to step back from both of those communities and see sometimes that being that insular and insulated is not actually the way to move in the world. And also sometimes that mainstream American culture has some real problems, especially around race and also around gender. And I certainly saw a lot of that around gender in my family. And so it really, I think, gave me the ability to be more empathetic and to see things from different people's perspectives. I grew up middle class, and my family was relatively well-resourced. What is interesting, my mother from Sweden, she came here because she wanted to go to graduate school for something that wasn't offered in Sweden, so she moved to America. And my other mother was in law school. And so when I was young, both of my parents were in school. We didn't have a lot of money, but then they both embarked on professional careers. And so I also got to see over the course of my life where my family has not necessarily changed social class, because in America you can't necessarily do that, but we've become more resourced. And so I have seen the choices that my family has made around money change just in my lifetime.
Wow.
And it's been particularly interesting, especially choosing the career that I have chosen, because I think that can kind of happen organically, but in my family, I've really been able to see it and mark it, and I think that's been of a lot of help when I talk with my clients and kind of work with my clients, because I can both see the kind of decisions that you need to make as a family and as individuals when you really need to balance your resources, and when there aren't necessarily all of the resources that you want to allocate to all of the different places. That's a really different conversation than I get to have with my parents now, where there are enough resources to do almost anything that my parents want. And so then it becomes a conversation about, well, how best to use those resources. And then we get to start having conversations about the social return as well as the financial return. And I actually feel very privileged to have been able to see that and to have that happen. And I can so clearly also trace it back to the hard work that my parents did in getting their advanced degrees and working in their careers.
Maya and I, interestingly enough, have a lot in common about the way that we approach finance, but we have very different backgrounds. I grew up in rural poverty and in de facto segregation. So I was on the south side of town, which is where all the black people lived. It's the only place we were allowed to live. And it was very clear to me growing up, very clear, that the reason that things were so hard for us is because we were female. So my father was mentally ill and not part of the family since I was a baby. And so, we were all women and we were black, and that was double hit against us. Thankfully, grew up with a head for numbers and decided that money was actually the issue. If we had enough money, everything would be okay. And so I made it a point to learn everything I possibly could about money. And what's really interesting is that in that process, because being a woman and in particular being black, because those two things were what I felt were kind of the reasons for a lot of the pain and suffering that came from poverty, I think in a lot of ways I wasn't very in touch with what could be considered more of my feminine side, and I certainly spent a lot of time trying to overcome being black, and I would secretly have some feelings that were very good when somebody couldn't tell that I was black on the phone, because I thought, my life would be better if I could pass. And so not only did I study money, I also studied, I didn't realize it, but I was doing a very intensive studying of white culture. And I didn't realize until a few years ago that there are these kind of aspects to who I essentially am that had been left behind. And it's been a process of letting it get quiet enough for me to notice where they still exist and where I can nurture them. It's in my nature to like be a fighter and to push myself and all that. And I'm like, and a lot of that's a reaction to poverty and a reaction to not wanting to be a woman and not wanting to be black. So I had to be like as tough as the guys, and I had to be as smart and successful as white people. And what I'm able to do now is have a lot of compassion for where that comes from and understand that that's not only not the truth for my life right now, but if I continue living in that way, the little girl that developed those defenses never gets a chance to be free. I recently went to a conference, and I go to these conferences at times, and this one was for young people with wealth. This was not just the 1%, because I go to a lot of those kind of social justice, people with wealth kind of meetings, and this was like the 1% of the 1%. I mean, the heirs of old blue chip companies, names that everyone's familiar with. And when I was there, I noticed something that I could only see in this rarefied environment. The people, they're social justice focused and very like progressive, but their body language, their arms like stayed particularly close to their sides, and all their movements with their bodies, their hands, their heads, and were all very muted. I put myself through white culture immersion, apparently. Like, it's been so long that I've been in white culture that it was actually hard for me to see it, and only in this rarefied environment where money's concentrated and power's concentrated, and even if it's something they're trying to get away from, I could feel this is what white culture looks like, and what moneyed culture looks like. It's very like close to the body. There's not very much freedom. It's about the stance of retaining a position of power. And there was also this deep sadness that was an undertone, and the deep sadness that was the undertone everywhere. And I felt very grateful for being able to be open enough to these very wealthy white people that I could actually have compassion for this. There was this deep sadness about their isolation, because money is not talked about. It's something that separates them from everyone else. It's something that gives them a different life experience from their friends, from the people that they would date. It keeps them from having a larger community. And seeing white culture and moneyed culture show up like that, it was the first time I really understood how blessed I was to grow up not necessarily with those things that I thought I wanted my whole life. It was the first time I really deeply felt like, oh, these people have been robbed from something very essential for human beings to have, which is, a community and freedom. It's made me feel even more committed to bringing community and specifically money and social justice work together, because I feel like those are gifts that I can bring from the way that I grew up. If we weren't in community, we wouldn't have survived. Everyone depended on one another quite a lot, and that happens in a lot of communities of color and marginalized communities. We have to depend on one another. And rather than it just being a necessity, it's shown up for me really as a gift too. It's like, oh, there's a way I just kind of naturally know how to be in community and know how that works. And it's something that I actually want for everyone. I've really seen with my own eyes at this point where I'm like, no, actually racism and sexism and classism and the hoarding of wealth are like social diseases that actually hurt all of us. I think there's a way in which I never really understood that until I could see the water I was swimming in. I had forgotten how different my experience was. There's a very specific story of how we met that has to do with us both being involved in social justice work and meeting through work that we were both doing in that realm. What I reflect on now when I hear that question, the first thing that comes to mind is that the person who is answering that question has been so changed by having Maya in my life that it's a little bit kind of like, wow, how do I answer that question? I guess I would have to answer it from the perspective of someone that had not had somebody as important as Maya in my life for so long. And I guess, without going into details, the thing that's been the most significant for me is that within our relationship, we listen to each other with an openness to being changed by what we hear. And I think that doesn't happen in the public discourse around politics and people's relationships, whether they're romantic, platonic. That doesn't really happen. We mostly aren't listening with an openness to being changed by what we hear. And Maya knows this. One of the greatest gifts of my life will be having been changed by her, by being more fully who I am, by having known her.
Rachel and I often say that we don't believe everything that we think.
Very important.
Which is
true.
It's really important. It's really important. And being able to express yourself and say what you're thinking and say how you're feeling, but then be in a place where you can listen to other people, and you can particularly listen to your best friend and your business partner who also lives in your building.
Yeah, 99% of the time it's a great thing, and then that 1% of the time when you want to complain to your best friend about your business partner is yeah.
It's really hard. Sometimes I'm like, Rachel, my business partner was out of shit today. And she's like, what'd she do? It's a delicate balancing act, and it's not, I would like to say that it's not one that everyone can do, but I don't think that's actually true. I think it's something that not everyone is willing to do. I think you have to meet someone who has very similar values and has a very similar way of communicating.
Yep. Those two things we came with when we met. How many years? 13 years old.
But you also then have to be willing to be changed by someone. And you have to be willing to grow, and you have to want to grow with someone. And if you are incredibly attached to your ego, and if you're incredibly attached to your personal identity, and if you're incredibly attached to being the person that you think you are, then you probably are not going to succeed. You have to be open to changing. And
it's funny, we joke and we say we're becoming one person. It's totally true. Because Maya and I say that, like, in the end, and this will sound weird, I am much softer than I started out, and that's primarily due to the influence Maya's had on my life. And Maya's much harder than she started out, mostly owing to, like, the influence I've had on her life. And in the gentlest form of those words, just talking about how our personalities have been shaped by the other. I mean, we both, when we met one another, we were younger, we were in our 20s. I was on the board of the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and Maya was also involved with that organization. And she was somebody that I was just meeting to do an informational interview. I was like, I'm not hiring anybody. The executive director asked me to talk to her. I was like, I can't. I just started this company. I can barely, like, deal with this on my plate. I was, like, ignoring emails. It's an incredibly intimate relationship, and what I find really interesting is that most of the time when people are talking about their business partner being their best friend, they decided to go into business with their best friend, and we were in a totally different situation. We actually chose one another based on our values and based on the fact that we had just had really complementary interests and skills, and we became friends. We became really close friends, and we share everything with each other, including I've adopted her family. Well, they've adopted me back too.
Rachel was the best blind date I've ever been on. Like, who knew?
How I balance being self-serving and selfless has really changed over the years. I think in the past I was so scared of falling back into poverty and all the things that come with poverty in my life that I was very driven, and the way that I went about being driven is a way that I think a lot of women do, which is like by being selfless and saying yes to a lot of things and maybe overcommitting. And there always seemed like a competition between being selfless and self-serving, like, you know, should I be pushing myself or should I be taking care of myself? And what I've started to notice that's happening in my life is that I have a meditation practice and a wonderful community of people that are really supportive in that. And as I settle into really trusting myself, what I'm realizing is that if I'm paying attention to what's trying to happen and seeing how that aligns with what I'm wanting, when those two things can align, that's usually when the perfect balance kind of shows up naturally, and there isn't a competition between pushing myself or, you know, not. So I think it's more about allowing that balance to happen by paying attention to what's trying to happen and maybe how I want to be part of that. Have you ever left the house and everything goes wrong and you're really trying to make it to this one specific thing and it's like everything's getting in the way of this happening? What I mean is that like in life, there are times when things seem to be unfolding kind of more naturally, and then there are times when things have a lot of difficulty with them. And I used to believe that it was my job to overcome the difficulty, and now I'm learning that it's my job to hear my own calling and also pay attention to what's trying to happen, because when those two can align, then that's where that perfect balance shows up. And it doesn't mean that I avoid things that are hard. It's just noticing where those two pieces are aligned. It's like an accelerator. It's like running with the wind at your back. Head's happy, heart's happy.
I have not always done a particularly good job of nurturing myself and my practice. I am not the best multitasker, which I think most people are not good multitaskers, but a lot of people don't admit it. And I was one of those people who did not admit it. But now, as Rachel and I get older, we also thankfully get wiser, as well as better looking. And I have come to realize that I'm not a particularly good multitasker. And so I think for many years I could either be in a space where I was nurturing myself, or I could be in a space where I was nurturing my firm and my office and my clients and my wonderful, amazing business partner. And I am on a journey to try to bring those two parts of myself closer together. And what really has helped me in that is understanding that I actually use exactly the same skills that I use to nurture myself that I use to nurture my firm. And realizing that I'm the same person with the same skills and just deploying them in different situations has made that a lot smoother. And I like to think of myself as quite a nurturing person. And so realizing that if I accept that about myself, that there's multiple different ways and different facets that I can bring that empathy and that nurturing and that caring out into the world. And some of them is through myself, some it's through my family and friends, and some of it is actually through my work as well.
I would add to your answer, because that's what I do. Being your best friend and business partner, one of the things that I've really noticed is like you are the most pleasant person to spend time with and be around, and it's not in your nature to either create or really give a lot of attention to conflict or things that don't feel good. But I've noticed in the past several years that you've really stretched and paid more attention to what's not feeling good, like where am I pushing past what feels right in order to nurture and take care of the business, for example, or my family or my friends. As you've paid attention to that, it's giving you more insight into like, oh, is there a way that I can show up for my family, my business, and also show up for myself by paying attention to like where there's something that isn't quite.
And to go off of Rachel's answer, that she felt like she was a person who overcame adversary. I think that I spent a lot of time thinking that I was a person who needed to make everything okay, which I think, as Rachel said, she is sort of conditioned in a certain way as a selfless woman. I think that also I was conditioned in a certain way to be a helper. And so realizing that I can be in not even necessarily conflict, but just have a different view than the group, and that can actually bring a different perspective that's valuable, seems like a really big step for me, even though it might not be a big step for everyone.
Rise is an alternative for investors that have social justice values. It's an alternative to socially responsible investing, which has now become quite greenwashed. And what it does is it pairs a very robust financial strategy with the first ever community developed social screens. And what that does is it ends up creating social screens that are very different from what you'll see anywhere else. Usually, for example, alcohol is the first thing to go in a portfolio, and our community is telling us that they don't want to necessarily screen out alcohol, but what they really care about is social justice. And that's why we're the first investment managers to really develop a comprehensive racial justice screen. So we're the first investment managers to do that because our community said, actually, we care very much about this. And when we said, there doesn't seem to be a way to measure that, that wasn't a good enough answer. So we had to find ways to measure it. And so it really creates an entirely different screen when it's community developed and you're listening to people and seeing what they really care about rather than responding to what might sound good to them or what you believe is already possible given the tools that exist in the financial industry. All things that are worth doing, kind of contrary to our American ethos, all things that are worth doing involve more than just ourselves. And I think that Rise is too important and too big for us to just think that we could do it kind of ourselves. So it really took more than just our own personal dedication. It actually took all of the support that we've received with people talking to other people about Rise, with people offering us their insights, their opinions, their research, all the different ways that we've been supported. It's kind of too big and important to just have come out of the heads of two individuals.
And in a very collective sense, even though it is the brainchild and the heart child of Rachel and I, it has been made immeasurably better by everyone who has given us their opinions and their views and their support and their thoughts. I mean, truly, it is, it's based in the community and it has been a community effort. And it is as good as all of the wonderful people in the community.
Yeah.
I love the analogy with music. Have you ever heard those courses that sing these really long notes where a chorus just holds one note and the only way it's possible is if some people are stopping and breathing at some points and that the rest of the chorus continues going? I really feel like that's exactly what's necessary for a community like Rise to work. It's no, you don't have to be knowledgeable on every single issue that's a part of our screens, but someone is paying attention to that. Right, and that's being held, the note of social justice is being held throughout, regardless of whether any one person is kind of advocating for it. And I think that's part of what hasn't worked with socially responsible investing. You get very fired up about an issue, and it's up to this one individual to go talk to their one advisor.
Yeah.
And you lose out on some of the beauty of having the whole chorus or the whole band.
And you need a whole community to be focused on multiple issues. I think to Rachel's point, there's a lot of people who are just really, really focused on carbon emissions. There's a lot of people who are focused on palm oil. There's a lot of people who are focused on occupied territories. And those people have a really deep knowledge in their one area. But we want our community to be made up of all of those people so we can all be focused on each other's issues together. Because we think that's how real change will happen. Absolutely.
I actually think that they're always together, and for reasons that I don't know the origins of, in business and in finance in particular, there's been a lot of praise and support for separating the emotions out.
Yes.
When in reality, we aren't necessarily creating them or bringing them in. We're kind of just acknowledging reality. So that, because money is connected to survival, of course it has emotions attached to it. Finance, of course it has emotions attached to it. And your business, if you're the business owner, your business is like a child. Of course there's emotions attached to it. Absolutely. And so it's not necessarily about can they coexist. It's more about how can we stop denying that they're already together.
Yeah, and I feel like we really take the view in finance and in business and with our own business is that we kind of think of it as several streams of information. Mm-hmm. There's the stream of information that's very easy to get from our profit and loss or from our client's net worth statement. It's what are our numbers? And then there's the stream of information that's how do we feel about all of this? And one view is not more important than the other. We can't make business decisions based on how we feel, but if we're making business decisions just on what's the smartest business decision, what makes us the most money, that's actually only half a decision as well. And so for us, it's getting very clear, the same way you'd want to get really clear about your books, right? You don't want them riddled with errors. We want to get very clear about what we're feeling so that we can bring those two halves together and make the best decision that we can.
And in the end, we've tried that before, making a decision that we thought, this makes the most sense, and it was like all head. And when we disregarded what was happening with our emotions and with our hearts, then what we find is like, oh yeah, this makes complete sense, except for the part where we feel like we're enslaved and, are owned by the business. Like, that thing. And then, suddenly it's not such a great decision anymore.
We have something that we use in our business. Rachel's laughing at me. We have something that we use that's called the path of doom. And you're not allowed to...
They have indicators. The path of doom has indicators. Like,
right.
you're on the path of doom when these things happen. It's decorated with, like, the little radioactive signs and skull and crossbones. And,
right.
Yeah.
It's like a decision tree. And if you make any of the decisions on the path of doom, you're taking the wrong branch of the tree. And so one of the pieces of the path of doom is it makes us hate our business and want to open a flower shop instead.
Yes, which is big because I don't like getting up early in the morning, and when you are a florist, you have to be up at like 4 a.m. Yeah. So if I want to do that instead of the business that we have,
then it's a bad idea.
Yes. Also, if we start thinking, this is so right, it's going to fix everything. We also learned that that's on the path of doom.
That is on the path of doom. If you ever think this is the answer, it will solve all of our problems, you are wrong, and you are making a decision on the path of doom. Here's another one that would probably be helpful, which is that if it requires the attention and time of more than one highly trained staff person to keep it going, it's a terrible idea.
Yeah. If it's a tool that requires more tools, we call it tools for tools is our shorthand for it. So like when we were kind of creating our own software, we're like, but then you need this thing on top of it to fix that problem. And we used to call it Mr. Potato Head with cancer. If you know, like Mr. Potato Head, I'm like, and then you like put the nose on, but the nose isn't working, so then you put a mask on Mr. Potato Head, and then the mask looks weird, and the hat doesn't fit anymore, so you put a bigger one on, and no tools for tools.
No tools for tools. Watch out for the path of doom. And ignoring your emotions is on the path of doom.
It is, actually.
It really is. Which is not the same as making emotional business decisions. I feel like when we talk about emotions, we talk about it more in personal finance, because that's what we do, than in our business, but everyone looks at us a little crazy and they say, well, wow, your clients must be making terrible decisions all of the time. I'm like, absolutely not.
And sometimes our emotions have information that we can't get with our prefrontal cortex. It's just dealing with a different part of the brain. So I think, as Maya was saying, like, we never want to be without a source of information. So if a client just can't move in a certain direction, they don't feel comfortable with it, rather than trying to overcome and persuade them, we really actually try to understand. Like, tell us, like, what's happening for you? What's the emotion that's coming up? Because anger is a very different emotion from fear, and they have very different origins. And frequently, we don't even know why we're feeling what we're feeling, but if we pay attention to those emotions, they can give us a lot more information than we otherwise have.
In the businesses these days, people talk a lot about values alignment, and I've never been able exactly to figure out what that means. I mean, it feels like a really big buzzword, values alignment, but I think, at least for me, my version of how I understand values alignment has actually a lot to do with emotion, and it has a lot to do with our approach of integrating our clients' emotions and our own emotions into our business. Because when I think about our clients, I do think about a whole person, right? There's their financial life, but then there's all of their emotional life. And they can't, and we can't help them make good decisions if we're ignoring those emotions. And to me, the next step beyond emotions is just values. And so it's what's important to them, and how can we help them determine what's important to them, because to Rachel's point, they don't always know, and then help them make decisions that align their financial life with that.
And these are the most important financial decisions people will ever make, so why wouldn't we want all sources of information there? Yeah, I frequently say that, like, ignoring emotions is kind of like you're driving and there's a screaming kid in the backseat, and you're kind of pretending that it's not impacting how you feel about driving or the decisions you make. It actually does. It's so much better to just be like, okay, let's figure out, is the child hungry? Like, what's going on?
And I think that people really expect to be judged for their emotions. We actually probably spend more time kind of convincing our clients that we want to hear what they're feeling and what they're thinking about what they're feeling than we do actually helping them, because they have all of the answers themselves. We're not providing them any answers that they don't already have.
The non-financial ones.
The non-financial ones. We're providing them a lot of financial answers. But in terms of emotion, we're not. We just need to help them understand that they can make good decisions.
And it's okay to actually be present with what's coming up for them.
Yeah. And I think it's very similar for our business. I mean, when Rachel and I are making decisions about our business and how we want to move forward, we try to think about, well, what impact will it have on our lives? What impact will it have on the lives of our staff? Is this something that we want? How do we feel about it? So the same way that we were saying that there's kind of like two streams of information with personal finance or with business finance, right? Or how we run our business. There's the stream of emotion and there's also the stream of just data. And what we try to do is bring those together. We feel like there's kind of two components of return as well. There's the sort of values aligned return, and then there's the monetary return.
Yeah, they're kind of like your financial return and your social return. And again, we feel like they're just the reality. Of course you care that you're going to be okay and make enough money in retirement, but if your best friend is eating cat food, then you have a really bad social return, right? And so you're not just purely happy. Yeah, people have historically said, well, let's just ignore the social return, but we're like, that's not how humans work in reality.
Or they focus solely on the social return, which is where you get things like people burning out in nonprofits or huge philanthropic giving.
Or businesses that don't work because they aren't looking at how are you adding financial value as well as social
And then
value.
you get the sort of capitalists run amok on the other side where you have people just doing terrible things, destroying the environment. To Rachel's point, trying not to cure people who are sick because, it makes more money to keep them on medication for life. So what we feel like what we need to do is we need to bring pieces from each of those streams together. And so when we're talking about return, the first and most important thing to understand is that we're saying, all right, what's your sort of social return and what's your financial return?
And we need enough of both.
Yeah.
And I think that understanding that is key to ensuring that you have an overall return that meets your personal needs as well as your needs as part of a larger world.
Yeah, because if you just want a social return,
you got philanthropy for that.
We do. You can give all of your money away. It's amazing. Go for it. Give all your money away. And if you just want a financial return, we can help you with some of that.
I know, we're not necessarily the right folks
We're
for
not
you.
the right folks. But if you want more of a financial return, we can help guide you in that direction. Mm-hmm. But Rise is really set up to give you as much as possible the best of both worlds. So you're not going to get a huge, amazing, startling financial return. And you're going to get a good social return as well. Not as good as if you gave all of your money away, but a good one.
And I think that that's the beauty of social justice investing is that we are optimizing return or optimizing your personal financial return with the social return. So I think that it's time for us to start having different conversations about returns where we stop cutting off kind of the fact that we're social beings. Yes. Solitary confinement is cruel and unusual punishment, and that's where you're cut off from the rest of the world. So why would we engage in similar behavior around our money? Why would we only think about our own personal return and not how it's impacting the world that we're a part of and the people that we share it with?
I think we haven't actually seen changes in people's core feelings and their core values and that social return. We haven't actually seen people change, which I think just says a lot about human needs and human emotions. Where I think we've seen the most change is that people see the direction that this country is going and they don't like it.
The lack of social return has become very real and personal.
Very, very real.
Or we've been investing in the corporations that actually put this particular president in power. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, maybe I don't want that return. Maybe, that gave me this amount, but also,
I think people are much more willing to face those choices than they have been in the past.
It's an American phenomenon, our kind of independence and our self-sufficiency that we prize so much. We've fallen asleep to the fact that we are naturally social beings. And I think that what's happening is that people haven't suddenly stopped caring about their financial return. I think that it's taken some pretty dire circumstances in order for them to wake up to their self, not just as an individual, but as a member of a larger world and community that we're all part of.
And I think that that's been particularly true in the American political system, but also I was just in Europe yesterday, and I think that it's also true in the wider world. It's not as much pushed by politics, but there's a huge conversation about climate change happening in Sweden right now. A third of their country is in the Arctic Circle, and everything is melting. I was in Stockholm, which is a city on the water, and they think that some of it might be underwater by 2050. And so people there are also making different changes with what they're supporting and different changes with their money, because people see overall the way that the world is going, and it's not a world that they want to bequeath to the future and their children, and they want to make different choices. And they can't. They made the choices, people together, all of us made the choices that got us where we are. We can make different choices. We have that power. I'm really excited about growing Rise. I mean, Rise is amazing, and I think we're at a really pivotal point in America, actually, which will trickle up and down into finance. Wow, this country is super messed up. I'm really excited about being a part and trying, with Rachel, lead a real change in how people invest. And even larger than that, to use the money in Rise and use the power of our community to really change behavior. So I'm really, really excited about kind of harnessing the power of our community and really making Rise into something that people want to be part of and that they want to listen to.
What I'm most excited about is that 3 of the largest forces for change have never been aligned before, and we're starting to align them. And social justice, or basically like the power of the people to come together and demand change, are a huge activator for change. But if they don't have some really serious follow through from the other major actors in the economy, like our corporations, for example, or our government, frequently those changes can fall flat or not have a lasting impact. And what makes me very excited is that if we not only give lip service to social justice, if we're actually bringing social justice in and having it form the basis of what we're doing, we're having large investment dollars completely aligned with social justice movements. And part of what's on our mind too is how can you pull in and have complete political alignment as well? Because if we can do that and do that on a community basis, then we have the power to make change that's really about improving the lives of everyone. And I've not seen a more powerful engine for change. And so when I look into the future with what's possible, it gives me the chills.
And we are, maybe reluctantly, but we are capitalists. And so we believe in harnessing the power of money. And I believe very strongly that money is just a force, like electricity or water. It can just be channeled and harnessed towards making good. The fact that it's mostly been harnessed to do terrible, awful things as really of no consequence to us.
Yeah,
we can make better choices.
And it's funny, we do say that we're capitalists, and at the core of that is being very pragmatic. I think that free markets are a reality. They need some oversight. They need some regulation. Free markets are great for making more of stuff that you want more of in the world, for making, for increasing and growing that. And if you don't want more of something like sickness, you probably don't want free markets necessarily operating in that realm. So I do think that free markets are the reality, and we're realists in that way. And they're huge forces for change if what we can do is align what needs to happen in the world with the investment dollars, right, that are behind making that happen.